I'm here, I'm Ed Monahan. I'm the public advocate for the Department of Public Advocacy. The Department of Public Advocacy is the statewide public defender program in Kentucky. We take court appointments in cases where people are charged with an offense and they're unable to employ counsel, and judges appoint us to those. We handled last year 156,000 cases in 120 counties. So these are misdemeanor cases, felony cases, and we're handling most all of the capital cases. So I'm Catholic, and I've been doing public defender work since 1975. For a 4.5-year period, I was the executive director of the Catholic Conference and was very active in that role with Kentucky Council of Churches. So I've had the privilege of working with Marion on various public policy issues, and I remain grateful for the work of the council and its witness through so many frames, but in particular through the frame of public policy work, because churches do speak to legislators in ways that require legislators to pay attention. So I want to talk today about discrimination in the criminal justice system. And I have two primary references. One is Reducing Racial Disparity in the Criminal Justice System. This is a document that's produced by the Sentencing Project out of Washington, D.C. And I'm going to hand out a piece of paper, and this is on that piece of paper. It's available for free on the web. This is a manual for practitioners and policymakers. So this is a high-level document that is highly accessible in terms of its form of writing style, and very practical, done by people that are in the arena. The other book that is a primary reference is the New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Color Blindness. And this is by Michelle Alexander, and I have a video clip in the program. So, our culture today is so pulled by simplicity, by reductionism, by either or, when what we know is life is full of complexity. And it's very dangerous in our culture to hear a fact without the context. So part of what I'm hoping to do today is to talk about the context and its complexity in order to inform us better as to what our opinion is about what is going on in our state and our culture, and what we may care to do about it. So there's racial discrimination, disparity. There's two kinds of disparity. Disparity is a straightforward concept. It exists when the proportion of a racial or ethnic group within the control of the system is greater than the proportion of such groups in the general population. So that's straightforward. That's disparity. And I was thinking about this, discrimination has a negative connotation in our culture, except we all have discriminated today, and we're proud of it. And we all have biases, and we're proud of them because it gets us through the day. We've discriminated in terms of we haven't exceeded the speed limit. We've left so we can get to the meeting ahead of time because we have biases towards our faith in terms of interpreting the reality that we see. So disparity is not discrimination, bias are not of themselves necessarily negative. But illegitimate racial disparity in the criminal justice system results from dissimilar treatment of similarly situated people based on race. This is what we find unacceptable. This is what we are not going to tolerate as people of faith, is to take two similarly situated people in a criminal justice system who are being treated differently for one reason, their race. So that's the focus of the conversation today. And this is the primary document, one of the primary documents I'm working on. I encourage, if you're interested in this, it's very accessible. Mark Maurer is the executive director of the Sentencing Project, and he's a leading thinker on sentencing issues and in particular race in the criminal justice system. So we have a little work this morning to do. I'd like you to, so here's the answer to the first blank, 8%. 8%. Any comments on that one? A little lower than you expected, okay. 13.6% of all arrests. So we see a disparity, a numerical disparity, based on what is occurring with people. So now our 14.2%, so the disparity is increasing. So the prison population in Kentucky, these are all Kentucky, 24%. And the percent of confined, the juvenile population in Kentucky is 31%, nearly 32%. So a comment or two about these facts. Have them next time.
The huge question, why?
Yeah, why? Why? What? So we're at the beginning here. We're not, we have an opinion, but see, I said yesterday, this, after people had this go, this is a confusing group for me. This is not my typical group I speak to. So you all throw me off here. Because you're not giving me the default answer I get almost always when I communicate this information. The first answer I get was, what do you think about this? Is, well, African Americans commit more crimes. So of course, that's the default response I get. So now, interestingly, I spoke to a class at the University of Louisville, and most of the members of the class, this was a class, I think the title of it was Legal Lynching. Most of the members of the class were African Americans, and their guesses on this were, most of their guesses were very much higher than what the facts were, which is also a point of information. They're speaking to their perceptions and their understanding of a reality. It's very, very informative. And you know, if we had more time, you know, one of the things to learn from this is where do you think we were compared to where we are, and what's the meaning of that, your differences. So I want to provide a little more context before we take the next step. I want to talk about crime rates. Now, the FBI does crime rates generally, and the FBI does crime rates for violent crime rates. I want to talk a little bit about the incarceration rates in both Kentucky and the United States. So, see, when I do this, how many people think crime rate is decreasing? I seldom get a hand go up. How many people think it's staying flat? I get a hand or two. Everybody thinks the crime rate's going up. Here's what the facts are. So it's a little bit hard to read, but the left-hand bar from 85 to 2012, the U.S. total crime rate is declining by nearly 40%. U.S. violent crime rate is declining by 31%. The Kentucky total crime rate over this period is declining by 6% and the violent by 27%. Now on the two bars on the right, what is the incarceration rate doing in this same time period? So in the U.S., it's increasing by 139%, in Kentucky 281%. 281%. So these are facts. So we see two different realities here. Now let's look at it in
Is that across ethnic groups?
yes. Yeah. Yeah. So let's look at the same data in a couple different formats to inform us. So these are the crime rates, same crime rates over the same period of time. And you can see two things from this, that the crime rates are declining. If we blew this, the bottom two lines are Kentucky, top two lines are U.S. The second thing we learned from this is that the crime rate in Kentucky is substantially lower and has been and remains lower than the U.S. So Kentucky has a low crime rate that's declining, relatively speaking, yet our incarceration rate is going through the roof. In fact, back in 2009, 2010, Pew Center for the States, Pew is out in a number of states looking at this issue, identified Kentucky as the state that had the largest increase in its prison population of any state in the nation. 2011. This is another graph, and it's a little bit complicated to see from the distance, but the line in the middle is the blue line is the actual number of people in Kentucky's prison system. So you can see that there was a decline, and in 2011, with the help of Pew, Kentucky passed House Bill 463, a 150-page crime bill that really took a lot of drug possession offenses and had presumed probation and diversion and emphasis on treatment. So the increase in the prison population dropped as a result of this good reform measure, which has had positive impacts in Kentucky. However, the dynamics of the criminal justice system in Kentucky are very clear. The criminal justice system has a primary response to behavior, jail or prison. That's what judges, prosecutors, that's their tool. They have a tool bag, and it has one tool in it. It's not a social service system, even though many of the people that come before the criminal justice system are primarily people in need of social services. The other reality is, you can pass a law, but it needs to be implemented. And we have in our system, and it's important that we have this, discretion. Professional discretion is critical to any functioning system. Judges, prosecutors, the parole board, criminal defense lawyers, public defenders, there has to be professional discretion. But we have so much professional discretion in Kentucky for judges and prosecutors and the parole board that if they disagree with the intent of a bill, like House Bill 463, they have the discretion to passively, aggressively undermine its intent. And that's part of what's going on. There's no doubt about that. So, at $22,000 per year per inmate, we could send somebody to college for that amount of money. Now, as the chief public defender, some people make presumptions about me and public defenders, so I want to clarify one. I am not standing before you, and I have never stood before anybody else and said, there aren't some people that should be in prison for a long time because they're violent and they're unable to control their violent behavior, and there are some people that need to be in prison for the rest of their life. However, we're overdoing it. We're overdoing it. There are low risk people in this that we're paying $22,000. It's a waste of money. It's abuse. It's abusive. And it's counterproductive for what we want in terms of the human individual's future behavior. Incarcerated Americans as a percent of the population. So over here in 1925, it's less than 0.1%. 2002, it's up to just under 0.5%. Here's another way to look at it, though. These are going to be numbers that maybe are more specific. This is the incarceration rates by race and ethnicity. So this is the number of people incarcerated per 100,000 people. So I'm showing you several different ways to look at the data. So this is the number of people incarcerated per 100,000. So it's an incarceration rate. Left-hand side is whites. It's 380 white persons incarcerated per 100,000 in 2010. Middle bar is Latinos, 966 Latinos incarcerated per 100,000 in 2010. This is national incarceration rates. African Americans in 2010, 2,207 African Americans incarcerated per 100,000. This is not disparity, this is high disparity. Now, fortunately, I guess, I was going to say unfortunately, but fortunately is the word. There's nobody in the room that's arguing the other side of this, so I'll do it for who's absent. One explanation is African Americans are committing crimes at a much, much, much higher rate than Latinos or whites. You'd almost have to say inherently African Americans have criminal behavior as part of it. Now, there are people that believe that and are very comfortable with these numbers, and they're making policy in our country. The frames that have been created in our culture are so strong that we're all subject to them. And
I was just going to, if it's okay, I wanted to jump in there because I wanted to share a workshop I attended by a Dr. Carol Taylor, who's with the School of Social Work at University of Kentucky. And she's African American, and she's researched biased perceptions in the child welfare protection system, which is, the professional social workers trying to assess whether a child is safe in a particular home or not, and how long they should be held outside the home. She looked at repeated large studies at the national level that showed that African American families are not more, if you control even for income, are not more dangerous or worse homes. In fact, arguably better at the same income range. But she found that the research shows that both white and black social workers perceived the African American homes as not being as fit to return children to. She said the ironic outcome of that is that the deaths in that system of children who are abused are higher in the white families, because the white families are more likely to get the child back. But what stuck with me was that this narrative, this frame that you're talking about of an oppressive system and a perception of some people as being less fit or more dangerous than others has actually been absorbed even by African American professionals in that system. And that was her main point. It just shows how incredibly powerful that frame is that you're talking about.
Yes, and I was at a panel program at the Kentucky Bar Association, and there was an African American prosecutor who took this Harvard implicit bias, and she said she was stunned that she had some unconscious biases against African Americans.
Undoubtedly, as an African American male, Personally, I've experienced discrimination. I've experienced being pulled over. I've experienced being the one who was considered a possible threat. Police asking me, pulling me over and asking me if, about my whereabouts. This is even in high school. I've got sons as well, African American, that are well educated, doing well, and I fear for their lives in the United States of America. My colleagues always ask me, well, you're always dressed up so nice and everything and all of that. There's a reason why, because of the same thing that you talk about. I would rather have some jeans on right now and maybe a t-shirt and just chill. But the fact is, I'm in Kentucky where the percentage of African Americans is 8%. African American males is probably a whole lot less than 8% of the population. I'm in a place that just saw the statistics recently in the United States that African American males make up 6% of the population, but we're 48% of the homicides in the United States. And so I fear for my life every day. And if it would not be for Jesus Christ in my life, I don't know how I would get by.
Ed, if you can take one more before you proceed.
Sure.
I'm probably the one person in here who's been on the other side of the tracks. I had the 12-year prison sentence. I did 3 of them inside of the prison system. And that's where the Lord met me. He met me exactly where I was at. And he changed my life from drugs and gangs. He called me into the ministry. And I made parole in 2006 and answered the call to preach and was ordained and was working and was out of school and was in school. And I take education very seriously, me and my wife. And my youngest daughter, I spanked her. And she's a fair child. And she had 2 bruises from the belt from jumping all over the place. And they came after me because of my record. How do you come after a guy who's changed his life around, is in school and working, and you pick him up with 6 police cars and a paddy wagon and a canine unit and a detective from the hospital because they thought I was abusing my daughter, but they saw he was on parole for drug trafficking. And I served an additional 7 months because of that. But if it wasn't for the Lord on my side, I wouldn't have got through it with the peace that I had and been able to implement prayer circles and even having guards come to the prayer circles and pray with the inmates and ended up being a chapel librarian of all things. But that's what we as black men face. I have a 13-year-old son, and he's already 5'8", and he's aggressive because he has ADHD. He likes to play a lot. But I tell him every day, if you don't change, I know what's going to happen to you. I fear for him. And I don't fear nobody, but I fear for him because I don't know if he's going to make it. I don't know if I'm going to have to go to his funeral because of him just playing around being a kid, because somebody's afraid of him. And it breaks my heart. It really does.
Thank you for that. Thank you for these witnesses. This speaks to the complexity of our reality. So we've talked a little bit about what you think, and we've had conversations. Let's look at what people think. So this is a national study done by the National Center for State Courts. So this is not a group with an agenda. So this is it's not a push-pull or anything. So Rehabilitation is seen as important by people. Prison's not up to the task. So 79% of the people say that people can turn their lives around. Perceptions of bias against lower income and minority offenders. So this was a question asked of everybody in the survey. Do you think the system is biased against Hispanics? Answer, yes, 40%. Non-English speakers, 43%. African Americans, 46%. Low-income people, 60%. So the view of people in our nation is that the system has inappropriate biases. But there's broad support for alternative sentencing for nonviolent offenders. So 51% of the people believe that that response by the criminal justice system should be often, 37% sometimes. This is contrary to the way the criminal justice system is treating nonviolent offenders. So the people want something different than what the system is doing. Support for sentencing reform is also very high. So I want to go through a couple of other pieces of information. Commonly identified causes of racial disparity in the criminal justice system. So the first one is the one that you all are not giving me, but most groups do, that there's a higher crime rate amongst the African Americans. And what we know is the statistics are clear. Drug use among African Americans and whites is about the same. But the arrest of African Americans is much higher for drug abuse. And part of this is based on police strategies. Where is the policing taking place? Is it taking place in areas where you're likely to be identifying drug abuse among African Americans, and you're not policing other predominantly white areas? That's the primary explanation for this. Inequitable access to resources. So we look at communities, and this is a very simple concept, one we all know about. So you look at two different families, two different communities. Their amount of resources that they have has an effect on how they respond to problems. So if you have a low-income individual in a low-income neighborhood that is a single parent and their child is constantly missing school, the resources that are present to respond to that problem are very much less than what it would be in a higher income community with a more intact family with more community resources. So the criminal justice system winds up with the problems that aren't being dealt with in the communities through resources. So that's an explanation for one explanation for the disparity. The other is legislative decisions, political agendas. The war on drugs is the primary cause of that's behind mass incarceration. Three strikes legislation. Now, this is three strikes legislation, persistent felony laws, habitual offender laws are public policy ways to the primary purpose is to deal with people who are incorrigible, people who have violent behavior. They're going to have violent behavior, and we need to incarcerate them for a long period of time, perhaps the rest of their life. And they've demonstrated that over a series of criminal events. However, it's an interesting concept, and I don't know that we would disagree with it. But here's the way it's played out. In Kentucky, we had what's called a model penal code that was passed in 74, 75. It was a model based on the best national thinking. And within 2 or 3 years, it started to degrade substantially. And the first substantial degradation of our model penal code back in the 70s was prosecutors went to the General Assembly and they said, we need a stronger persistent felony offender law. And what they got was a law that says you can be a second-degree PFO if you have one prior low-level felony and you've never served any time in prison, which is not the concept of persistent felony offender statutes. So you can have one low-level felony, you get probated, you have a second low-level felony, and now you're a persistent felony offender in Kentucky. And the penalty range goes up substantially. And the leverage that a prosecutor has in terms of offering plea offers is huge now, because they say, we'll drop the persistent felony offender law if you plead guilty to more time on the underlying charge. And Kentucky now has the broadest persistent felony offender law in the nation. We're sweeping in more people. And we've also created a violent offender law. The federal government in the 80s came in and said, we're going to keep some of our federal money that we were going to give you unless you create an 85% parole eligibility. 85% parole eligibility is you spend the rest of your life in prison. And Kentucky said, oh my goodness, we don't want to lose that federal money. So of course we'll have an 85% parole eligibility law, and we have one. Now, for violent offenders. So we have persistent felony offender law and violent offender law. What's happened since the violent offender law and this threat of losing federal money is every year, every couple of years, prosecutors come in and said, we need to expand that violent offender law to cover more people. And the General Assembly has been highly responsive to this. So we now have over 8,000 people of this 20-some thousand I showed you on this chart. 8,000 of them are in prison as in our Kentucky prisons as a persistent felony offender or a violent offender, and we're spending about $170 million just on those 8,000 people. They'll be there for pretty much the rest of their life. And so we have taken a reasonable concept of saying we have to have a public policy response to incorrigible repeat offenders, and we've now broadened it out beyond its intended purpose. Over-reliance on incarceration, as I said, the criminal justice system has a tool, and there is overt racial bias in this. So these are the explanations that Mark Maurer is talking about. So crime rates and arrest rates are dependent on what law enforcement does. The differences and advantages we talked about. So there's decision-making that goes on in the criminal justice system that also explains some of this disparity. I'm moving a little bit ahead because also I have not had this much conversation in the groups I do this with, so I got more here. You all are causing me to access my adaptive behaviors here.
I have a brief question.
Yes, sir.
I believe the data, but I'm trying to remember. I believe the data in terms of finding out that there is equal drug use between white and black, and that crime rates have been going down, but divorced from incarceration rates, how is that data collected? How does one find out that whites and blacks are using drugs at the same rate, for example?
Researchers study this through various data searches, quantitative and qualitative data, and they render an opinion.
I'm itching to ask. I'm an employment training specialist, and a lot of the clients that I work with, they now are felons because of failure to pay child support. Do you see this as a part of the racial disparity too? Because in Christian County, where I live, the amount of African American fathers that are going to jail and getting sentences from years. One guy I was working with went to jail for 3 years for failure to pay child support.
Yeah.
Does this fall within this racial disparity?
The racial disparity in Kentucky and nationally in the criminal justice system is it's across the system. And we have people that we've worked out a job for them, and judges are so angry at them they send them to prison when we have a job and the employer saying that they're going to employ them. Some of the nonviolent, the flagrant non-support, there's all kinds of a social context, and there can be mental illness, and the response to send somebody to prison for that is quite simplistic.
Joe Phelps, who is the minister of a church in Louisville at Highland Baptist, did an article about going down to the Hall of Justice and how shocked he was at what he saw. And I responded to his article by saying, if you look just visually at what's going on down there, you have your attorneys in your $500 to $1,000 suits. You have your police officers with their belts and their guns. And then you have the rest of the people who look like they're in yard sale clothes. So visually, I saw a caste system. And when you're talking about the poor, I think that for those clergy who have never visited down to the court system to see actually what goes on, it's very visual.
Yeah, and Michelle Alexander speaks to the racial caste system that we have in this country, and we have it. So I don't have time to do this, but because you all are so good, I do want to talk about expungement.
Yes.
Increasingly, states have what they call felony expungement. So you have a low-level felony, and you complete your sentence, and for 5 years after that period of time, you have no other criminal behavior. Then you're eligible to have your felony expunged, and the law says you can then, when you apply for a job, you don't have to check the box that says you have a prior felony, because it literally no longer exists. And it's a way to do a couple things. One, encourage good behavior. Recognize that a lot of low-level felony single offenses are done by people in a stupid moment, like a college kid, and that the empirical data is very clear that if you go 5 years, and they've broken this down based on crime and age, so this is an oversimplification, but if you go 5 years and you haven't committed another offense, you are now, the probability of you committing another criminal offense is the same as anybody in the general population. So the expungement law is reflective of actual behavior of people empirically. And it allows people to get jobs, support families, integrated back into the community. This, if you have a felony, you are prohibited from, there's all kinds of consequences. You can lose your scholarship, your subsidized loan if you're in college. You no longer can get a license in a number of professions. You can no longer live in subsidized federal housing. So we've been clear, if you have a felony, you may as well put a big F on your forehead because you've been ostracized. And so people of faith say, we believe in forgiveness, we believe in redemption, we believe in helping people who are sinners. That's what we believe in. Unfortunately, there's a group of people in our community that says, if you did something wrong, you did something wrong. And yeah, you ought to pay for it the rest of your life. Now, I think the middle path for us is the pragmatic one. people who have felonies come back into our communities. Don't we want them to succeed? We want them to provide for their families? Don't we want them to go on a different path? Isn't it in our self-interest, our raw self-interest as people in a community, to figure out a way to help them have a better way forward? Here's number of Kentuckians eligible for Class D felony expungement. So one low-level felony, they haven't committed another offense in 5 years. What's your guess? How many people in Kentucky right now? Zero? Okay, that's pretty low.
You mean people who've gone 5 years without recommitting?
Right, and they have one low-level Class D felony. These would be people who would be eligible to have their felony expunged if we had a law that said that could be done. 2,500. To what? You're coming up from zero to what?
Oh, to probably 90,000.
90,000. That's a lot. 500. Here's the number. These are people in our neighborhoods who have an economic death sentence. They're politically excluded. We're going to get to that. I'm going to skip over this. We're going to get to that one right now. Legal.
Do we have a law or we don't have a law? Or we have a law?
We do not have a felony expungement law. We're going to move now to some people conflate these two. I know you all aren't the type, but the other issue is felony disenfranchisement. So if you have a felony conviction, you lose your right to vote. And the only way you get it back in Kentucky is the governor has to give you an individual pardon. That's a pretty big step to take. And Governor Fletcher, for instance, was less responsive to those requests. Governor Beshear has been highly responsive to those. League of Women Voters has done a study, and we're only one of 4 states that permanently disenfranchise. Most states have an automatic restoration of voting rights once you do something like complete your sentence. We have the 3rd highest rate of disenfranchisement in the country. 1 out of every 14 Kentuckians doesn't have the right to vote. We're over in Iran. We're proud of those purple thumbs. And we have the 2nd highest African American disenfranchisement rate in the country. More than 1 of every 5 African Americans in Kentucky can't vote. That's incredible. There's been this context through the war on drugs to sweep in massive amounts of people into the system. And it's like a poll tax. And it's just as effective as a poll tax. It's just a different method. Metaphorically, the new Jim Crow and all who care about social justice should fully commit themselves to dismantling this new racial caste system. This is her call. So let's listen to her now.
And what I learned in that process is that my great crime wasn't in failing to represent an innocent man. My great crime was in imagining that there was some path to racial and social justice that did not include those we view as guilty. And I learned some facts that blew my mind. I learned there are more African American adults under correctional control today, in prison or jail, on probation or parole, than were enslaved in 1850, a decade before the Civil War began. I learned that as of 2004, more black men denied the right to vote than in 1870, the year the 15th Amendment was ratified, prohibiting laws that explicitly deny the right to vote on the basis of race. Now, of course, during the Jim Crow era, poll taxes and literacy tests operated to keep black folks from the polls. Well, today, In many states, felon disenfranchisement laws accomplish what poll taxes and literacy tests ultimately could not. A black child born today has less of a chance of being raised by both parents than a black child born during slavery. And this is due, in large part, to the mass incarceration of African American men. There was an article published about this in The Economist magazine a while back entitled, "How the Mass Incarceration of Black Men Harms Black Women." And the article explained that the majority of black women in the United States, including about 70% of professional black women, are unmarried, and that this was due in large part to the mass incarceration of black men, which takes them out of the dating pool at the years they would be most likely to commit to a partner, to a family. But what's worse is that by branding them criminals and felons at early ages, often before they're old enough to vote, they're relegated to a permanent second-class status for life, in which discrimination against them is perfectly legal in employment, housing, access to education, and basic public benefits. Once branded a criminal or felon, finding work in the legal economy becomes extraordinarily difficult, if not impossible, making it unlikely that they will be able to play the role of a traditional father or hold together marriages over the long term. To a large extent, mass incarceration has decimated black families to a degree comparable to slavery.
I want to wrap it up with some hope here. We need some hope. Okay, this is the hope. Lay down our racial bribes, join hands with people of all colors who are not content to wait for change to trickle down, and say to those who would stand in our way, accept all of us or none of us. So, and her call to us is, do what Martin Luther King did when he was at the People March. Convert this from a civil rights to a human rights issue so that we can all stand together working for a better way forward for all human beings. That's her call. Now, what do we do? Somebody asked me the question, so what do we do yesterday? And that's, if we had a little more time, you would be asking me that. You know, if we all were headed off to some counseling today, to a good counselor, the first thing the counselor would do would help us see what our problem is, to be aware of it. Because the counselor would know if we're not going to be working on any problems we're not aware of. We have to be aware of something to decide whether we want to work on it. So I think churches are an ideal place to invite people to awareness about this issue, because aware of the degree of this problem, the serious nature of it, its apparent intractability, call any person of faith and hope to set themselves about working on it in a way that's a way forward. And churches have great power. Legislators have no choice but to listen to people of faith. And I encourage churches to invite legislators, to have a respectful conversation with legislators, to educate legislators, to have people in your faith community sitting there talking about their struggle and their attempt to come back into the community, but the barriers that they face because of this. And a request for legislators to help change what Kentucky's policy is in the way that we're dealing with this. I believe churches are a way for us to move forward. But if we went to most churches, many of the people we sit next to in the pew are not aware of this. So I'm very hopeful about this. There's a Right on Crime group in Texas. It has Newt Gingrich, Grover Norquist, William Bennett, Edwin Meese, who are saying now that this over-incarceration has to be dealt with, that we're spending, now they're doing it out of their own frame, which is government is spending a lot of money that is not having positive outcomes. And when we incarcerate juveniles, when we incarcerate even for 2 to 3 days a low-risk person in our jails, pre-trial, waiting, and this is not hypothetical, these are documented studies. The Arnold Foundation is in Kentucky. Arnold Foundation is a conservative think tank. They're doing massive data analysis on pretrial release. And what they're finding is if you're in jail for as few as 2 to 3 days and you're low risk, that you there's a high correlation with future criminal activity. It's a stunning finding. Now, that's not causation, that's correlation. So there's some limitation to the data. But that's stunning. We're spending $30 to $60 a day to house someone that's a low-risk inmate because they're too poor to get out on bond because they don't have $100. And we're increasing their chance of future criminal activity. It's certifiably insane. But conservatives are starting to speak to this out of their own rationale, and they're starting to speak to it in Kentucky. So I believe if we can do our part here, that we will, over the course of future years, begin to move in a different direction in Kentucky based on if we do our part of the work.